The Donovan estate stood on the edge of Asheville's rolling hills, surrounded by thick groves of pine and oak. The mansion was an architectural marvel, its towering spires and expansive wings casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. Yet, despite its grandeur, the house felt lifeless. Inside, high ceilings amplified the sound of every creak and echo, and the faint scent of polished wood lingered in the air. Richard Donovan sat in the study, his gaze fixed on the flames flickering in the stone fireplace. His tailored suit hung loosely on his frame, a testament to the sleepless nights and stress that had consumed him since his wife's passing 2 years ago. Papers and files lay scattered across his desk, but he hadn't touched them. His mind was elsewhere, on Sophie, his 6-year-old daughter, who had stopped speaking the night of the accident. The faint sound of a door opening pulled Richard from his thoughts. He turned as Emily Harper entered, clutching her modest bag. Her bright eyes scanned the room, though they faltered slightly under the weight of the mansion's imposing atmosphere. "Mr. Donovan," she greeted softly, her voice carrying a mixture of professionalism and nervousness. She smoothed her cardigan with trembling hands, aware that she stood in a world far removed from her own modest upbringing. Richard nodded curtly, his expression unreadable. "Miss Harper, thank you for coming." Emily hesitated before stepping further into the room. "I'm honored to be here. I know Sophie's been through a lot, and I'll do my best to help her." Richard's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. He gestured toward the staircase. "Her room is upstairs. Sophie can be challenging. Just do your job, and let me know if you need anything." As Emily climbed the winding staircase, the sense of unease settled deeper in her chest. She'd read about the Donovans. Tragedy had struck what seemed like the perfect family. Now, stepping into their home, she felt the weight of that sorrow pressing against the air. At the top of the stairs, she found Sophie's door slightly ajar. Inside, the little girl sat on the floor with her back to the doorway, her small frame hunched over a stack of papers. Emily paused, unsure if she should interrupt. "Hi, Sophie," Emily said gently. The girl froze but didn't turn around. Emily swallowed, sensing the fragility of the moment. This was her first test, a quiet, withdrawn child in a house filled with echoes of loss. Emily resolved to find a way to reach Sophie, no matter how long it took. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Donovan mansion, casting long beams across the polished wooden floors. Emily Harper stood at the base of the staircase, adjusting her sweater and rehearsing her introduction to Sophie in her head. Her first encounter with Mr. Donovan had been formal, almost cold, and she wasn't sure what to expect from his daughter. Richard appeared at the top of the stairs, his posture as rigid as the environment around him. He descended quickly, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the steps. "She's in the sunroom," he said without preamble. His voice carried a hint of impatience. "It's where she spends most of her mornings." Emily nodded, gripping her notepad tighter. "Thank you." He hesitated for a moment before speaking again, his tone edged with doubt. "Just do your best. Sophie isn't easy to reach. Many have tried." As he walked away, Emily felt the weight of his words settle on her. She followed his instructions and made her way to the sunroom, her footsteps soft against the hallway's runner rug. The room was awash with natural light, its walls lined with bookshelves and tall glass windows offering a view of the sprawling garden. In the corner, Sophie sat cross-legged on a thick rug, her small frame hunched over a puzzle. Her dark curls spilled over her face, partially obscuring her features. Emily approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "Good morning, Sophie," she said softly, kneeling a few feet away. Sophie didn't respond. She continued to piece together the puzzle with quiet determination, as if Emily weren't even there. Undeterred, Emily sat on the floor and observed the puzzle's picture, a vibrant meadow dotted with wildflowers. "That's a beautiful puzzle," she offered, her voice warm. A brief pause. Sophie's hand hovered over a piece before she resumed her work. Emily caught the slight tilt of her head, a subtle acknowledgement that gave her a glimmer of hope. Later that day, Richard found Emily in the kitchen. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice clipped. She didn't speak, Emily admitted, her honesty disarming. "But I think she listened." Richard's frown deepened. "Listening isn't enough. "She'll come around," Emily said, meeting his gaze with quiet confidence. "She just needs time." As he walked away, his doubt was evident, but so was the faintest trace of curiosity about Emily's persistence and maybe even her resolve. The soft patter of rain against the mansion's tall windows gave the morning an air of melancholy. Emily stood in the kitchen, rinsing a mug as her thoughts wandered. The silence of the house was almost oppressive, broken only by faint sounds of Sophie shuffling in the sunroom. The stillness reminded Emily of the group home where she had spent most of her childhood. Long, quiet days punctuated by the occasional outburst from a housemaid or the distant laughter of visiting families. She had been 8 when her parents passed, leaving her and her younger brother to navigate a world that felt suddenly vast and indifferent. She leaned against the counter, gripping the edge. Sophie's withdrawn demeanor was all too familiar, and Emily knew the patience it took to coax someone out of that shell. She exhaled, steadying herself, then headed toward the sunroom. Inside, Sophie sat at her usual spot near the window. This time, instead of her puzzle, she was holding a stack of crayons and a blank sheet of paper. Emily paused in the doorway, surprised but careful not to disturb the moment. "Are you drawing something?" she asked softly, stepping closer. Sophie didn't respond, but her small hand moved deliberately across the paper. Emily took a seat nearby, giving the girl space while watching her create. Though the lines were tentative and uneven, the beginnings of a house took shape, surrounded by what looked like flowers. "Those are lovely," Emily said. For a brief moment, Sophie glanced at her, her expression unreadable but not dismissive. Emily felt a flicker of hope. Meanwhile, upstairs in the study, Richard sat at his desk, his phone pressed to his ear. Evelyn's voice was sharp and commanding, even through the receiver. "I don't understand why you thought hiring her was a good idea," Evelyn said. "She's young, inexperienced, and from what I hear, she doesn't exactly come from the right background." Richard pinched the bridge of his nose. "Sophie needs someone who can connect with her. The others didn't work. And you think this girl will?" Evelyn's tone was heavy with skepticism. "You're gambling with Sophie's well-being." "I'm doing what I think is best," he said firmly, though doubt lingered in his mind. As the call ended, Richard leaned back in his chair, staring at the family portrait on his desk. Evelyn's words clung to him, feeding into the guilt that had shadowed him since his wife's death. Downstairs, Emily caught Sophie watching her as she tidied the crayons. It was only for a second, but it felt like progress, a tiny step toward connection in a house that had long been filled with silence. The morning sunlight streamed through the mansion's large windows, brightening the once muted atmosphere. Emily stood by the kitchen counter, arranging a small basket with scissors and a jar for water. She had noticed Sophie's interest in the garden during their brief interactions and decided to introduce an activity that might spark more engagement. When Emily entered the sunroom with the basket, Sophie's eyes flickered toward her before settling back on her drawing. Emily knelt beside her, keeping her voice light and inviting. "I thought we could go outside today," she said, gesturing toward the garden visible through the glass doors. "There are some beautiful flowers blooming. Maybe we can collect some petals and make something pretty." Sophie hesitated, but eventually stood, clutching her crayon. Emily smiled, leading the way. The garden was lush and vibrant, filled with rows of roses, daisies, and wildflowers. The scent of freshly cut grass and blooming petals filled the air. Emily crouched beside a bed of marigolds, snipping a stem and placing it in Sophie's hand. "See how soft the petals are," Emily said, brushing one with her fingers. Sophie mimicked her, her small fingers brushing the petals before a hint of a smile crossed her lips. It was fleeting, but Emily caught it and felt a surge of encouragement. Their quiet bonding was interrupted by the sharp sound of heels clicking on the stone path. Emily turned to see Evelyn approaching, her expression stern and disapproving. "Emily," Evelyn greeted curtly, her eyes scanning the garden scene. "What exactly are you doing with Sophie?" Emily rose slowly, keeping her tone polite. "We're collecting petals for a craft project." Sophie seemed interested in the garden. Evelyn's brow furrowed. "Is this your idea of helping her? Playing in the dirt?" Before Emily could respond, Evelyn turned to Richard, who had just stepped onto the patio. "Richard," This is absurd. You're letting a stranger waste Sophie's time when she needs professional help. Richard's jaw tightened as his gaze shifted between Evelyn and Sophie, who had retreated behind Emily, clutching her basket. Evelyn, that's enough, he said firmly. She's your daughter. Evelyn pressed. This isn't a game. Sophie deserves better than this. As Evelyn's words lingered in the air, Richard noticed something unexpected. Sophie was watching Emily intently, a rare smile tugging at the corners of her lips. It was small, but unmistakable. Later, as Evelyn stormed back inside, Richard lingered on the patio, his eyes following Emily and Sophie as they continued their quiet activity. He still couldn't bring himself to express gratitude, but for the first time, he began to wonder if he'd underestimated Emily's approach. The mansion was quiet that evening, the only sound coming from the soft patter of rain against the windows. Emily sat cross-legged on the living room rug, sorting through the colorful petals Sophie had collected earlier. The child sat nearby, her crayons spread across the coffee table as she worked on another drawing. Richard lingered in the doorway, unnoticed. He had returned from a long day at work, his tie loosened and his expression weary. He watched from a distance as Emily gently encouraged Sophie, her voice warm and patient. "Are those clouds in the sky?" Emily asked, pointing at Sophie's drawing. Sophie hesitated, her small hand hovering over the paper. She glanced briefly at Emily, her wide eyes full of something unspoken. "They look beautiful," Emily continued, filling the silence without pressuring her. "Maybe we can add some flowers to the ground next?" Sophie nodded almost imperceptibly, reaching for a green crayon. The scene was so ordinary, yet Richard felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. He was grateful Sophie seemed more at ease, but frustrated with himself for not being the one to draw her out. As the evening wore on, Emily cleaned up while Sophie lingered at the coffee table, staring at her finished picture. Emily knelt beside her, holding up the petals they had collected earlier. "We can press these tomorrow, make a beautiful keepsake for your drawing." Sophie turned to Emily, her lips parting slightly. She leaned closer and whispered, barely audible, "Emily." Emily froze, her heart skipping a beat. She searched Sophie's face, tears already welling in her eyes. "Sophie," she whispered back, her voice trembling. Richard stepped into the room, his gaze fixed on Sophie. What did she say?" he asked, his voice almost breaking. Emily turned to him, her expression soft yet filled with awe. "She said my name." Richard looked at Sophie, who was now clutching her drawing and staring down at it. Relief washed over him, but it was quickly followed by a wave of guilt. Why hadn't he been able to reach her? Why had it taken a stranger to bring this change? Emily, sensing his conflict, spoke gently. "It's a start, Mr. Donovan. It's a sign she's ready to heal, little by little." Richard nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "Thank you," he muttered, his gratitude tinged with the weight of his unresolved emotions. In that moment, the silence that had defined their home for so long felt a little less oppressive. The sun hung low in the sky, casting golden light through the mansion's windows as Emily stood in the kitchen, preparing Sophie's evening snack. A light knock at the back door startled her. She turned to find Claire, an old friend and former co-worker from her waitressing days, standing there with a warm smile. "Claire," Emily exclaimed, wiping her hands on a dish towel and opening the door. "I was in town and thought I'd stop by," Claire said, glancing around the sprawling kitchen with wide eyes. "Wow, this place is something else." Emily chuckled nervously. "It's certainly different from what I'm used to. Come in for a bit." As they sat at the small kitchen table, Claire's gaze softened. "I always knew you'd find a way to make a difference, Emily. You were always so good with people, even when you didn't get much kindness in return." Emily's smile faltered, and her hands tightened around her mug. "It wasn't easy, but it taught me resilience. And Sophie, she reminds me of myself at her age." Claire nodded knowingly. "I remember how you always looked out for your siblings, even when the odds were against you. That kind of heart doesn't go unnoticed." Neither noticed Evelyn standing just outside the doorway, her face pinched with disapproval as she caught snippets of the conversation. "Anyway, I should let you get back to it," Claire said, standing. "But don't forget where you came from." Emily. It's part of what makes you special. After Claire left, Emily returned to Sophie, who was sitting cross-legged on the rug in the living room. She was drawing again, her crayons scattered around her. Emily leaned over, curious. The drawing depicted 3 figures holding hands, a small girl with dark curls, a taller woman with light hair, and a man in a suit. They stood in front of a simple house, surrounded by flowers. "That's beautiful, Sophie," Emily said softly, her voice catching. "Is that us?" Sophie nodded shyly, her eyes darting between Emily and her drawing. Richard entered the room just then, pausing as he noticed the drawing. His throat tightened at the sight, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. "She's imagining a family," Emily said gently, glancing at Richard. His gaze softened, but fear flickered in his eyes. He admired Emily's warmth and connection with Sophie, but the idea of opening himself to such vulnerability again was terrifying. As Sophie handed the drawing to Emily, Richard lingered in the doorway, grappling with emotions he wasn't ready to face. The sharp ring of Richard's phone echoed through his study, cutting through the quiet of the morning. He snatched it from the desk, his tone clipped as he answered. "Donovan." On the other end, his lawyer's voice was tense. "The lawsuit's gaining traction. The opposing counsel is pushing for a settlement." Richard pinched the bridge of his nose, a deep sigh escaping him. "We're not settling. They have no case. Keep pushing back. You know this could drag on for months," the lawyer replied. "And the media is sniffing around. Just do what I'm paying you for," Richard snapped, ending the call. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on him. The legal battle threatened his company's reputation, and the stress of managing both his professional and personal life was wearing thin. Later that day, Richard found Emily and Sophie in the garden. Sophie was arranging flower petals on a small tray, her movements careful and deliberate. Emily sat beside her, encouraging her gently. Richard approached, his voice unintentionally sharp. "Emily, I thought we discussed Sophie's schedule. She should be working on her reading, not this." Emily straightened, her expression calm but firm. "Sophie is expressing herself in ways she hasn't in months, Mr. Donovan. She's finding her voice again, even if it's not through words yet." "That's not enough," Richard retorted, his frustration spilling over. "She needs structure, not distractions." Emily stood, meeting his gaze without flinching. "With all due respect, Mr. Donovan, you can't rush her healing. Sophie needs patience and understanding, not rigid expectations." Richard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The tension between them hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Sophie looked up from her tray, her wide eyes darting between the two adults. Emily knelt beside her, her voice softening. "It's okay, Sophie. Keep going. You're doing wonderfully." As Sophie resumed her work, Richard exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I'm trying to do what's best for her," he said, his tone quieter. "I know you are," Emily replied gently, but her eyes held a challenge. "But sometimes what's best isn't what's easiest or most immediate." Richard studied her for a long moment, a mix of frustration and reluctant respect flickering across his face. "You're determined. I'll give you that," he said finally, his voice edged with a hint of grudging admiration. Emily didn't back down, because she deserves that much. Later, as Richard retreated to his study, he couldn't shake Emily's words. They lingered, challenging the carefully constructed walls he had built around himself. For years, emotional detachment had been his armor, but now it felt more like a cage. Meanwhile, Emily stayed with Sophie in the garden, her resolve firm. She wasn't just Sophie's nanny, she was her advocate, and she wouldn't let Richard's fear or frustration derail the progress they were making. The late afternoon sun bathed the Donovan estate in a golden glow, casting long shadows over the garden. Emily stood by the porch, her brow furrowed as she scanned the tree line. Sophie's frantic voice had cut through the usually calm air just moments ago. "Mr. Floppy's gone," Sophie had cried, clutching an empty rabbit hutch. Emily had knelt beside her, offering calm reassurance. "We'll find him, Sophie. He can't have gone far." Now, she and Richard trudged through the wooded area at the edge of the property. The tension between them had softened since their earlier confrontation, replaced by a shared focus on Sophie's beloved pet. "Mr. Floppy?" Emily called out, her voice carrying through the trees. "If I were a rabbit, where would I hide?" Richard smirked faintly, walking a few paces behind her. "Somewhere safe and quiet. Rabbits don't exactly enjoy attention." Emily glanced over her shoulder. "Sounds like someone else I know." The remark caught him off guard, and his smirk widened into an actual smile. "Touché." They walked in companionable silence for a while, the sound of crunching leaves beneath their feet the only noise. Emily crouched near a bush, peering into its shadows. "Sophie must have been so scared when she saw the hutch empty," she said softly. Richard stopped nearby, his expression clouding. "She's been through enough already. Losing something else, even a rabbit, feels like too much." Emily looked up, catching the strain in his voice. "You're doing your best, Richard. Sophie knows that." He hesitated at her use of his first name, but the warmth in her tone disarmed him. "Sometimes I wonder if my best is enough," he admitted. "She's been through so much, and I've failed her in so many ways." Emily stood, brushing dirt from her hands. "You haven't failed her. You're here, trying every day. That's what matters." Before Richard could respond, a soft rustling came from the undergrowth. Emily turned, spotting a flash of white fur. "There!" she exclaimed, rushing forward. Richard followed as Emily carefully coaxed the rabbit out from beneath a fallen branch. She cradled it in her arms, her face lighting up with relief. "You're a hero," Richard said with a quiet chuckle. Emily glanced at him, a playful glint in her eye. "Don't tell Sophie, or she'll think I can do anything." They laughed together, the sound echoing warmly through the woods. For a moment, the weight of their individual burdens lifted, replaced by a rare sense of ease. As they walked back toward the house, Richard's laughter faded, replaced by a conflicted expression. He stole a glance at Emily, who was gently stroking the rabbit's fur. There was something about her resilience, her kindness, that drew him in, yet it also terrified him. When they reached the garden, Sophie ran to meet them, her face lighting up as she saw Mr. Floppy. She hugged the rabbit tightly, murmuring a quiet "thank you" to Emily. Richard lingered on the porch as Emily knelt with Sophie, his heart pulling in two directions. He admired Emily's ability to connect with Sophie, her unwavering strength in the face of challenges. But the thought of letting himself care for her, of letting someone in, felt impossible. Emily glanced back at him, her smile gentle. "Looks like today had a happy ending after all." Richard nodded, forcing a smile. "Thanks to you." As the evening settled in, Richard retreated to his study, grappling with feelings he couldn't fully name. Emily had found her way into Sophie's world, and now, it seemed, into his as well. The sun was barely up when Evelyn arrived unannounced at the Donovan mansion, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Emily, still in the kitchen preparing breakfast, glanced up as the older woman entered, her presence commanding and cold. "Miss Harper," Evelyn said, her tone clipped, her eyes scanning Emily from head to toe as if assessing a challenge. "Good morning, Mrs. Cooper," Emily replied politely, though the chill in Evelyn's demeanor made her grip the counter just a little tighter. Evelyn stepped closer, her lips pursing. "I've been meaning to speak with you. It seems you've become quite integrated into this household." Emily turned off the stove, wiping her hands on a towel as she faced Evelyn directly. "I'm here to help Sophie. That's my job." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Is that all it is? A job? Because from where I stand, you've become quite comfortable." "Too comfortable, perhaps." Emily's heart sank, but she kept her composure. "I care about Sophie deeply. She's making progress, and that's what matters." "That's what you want us to believe," Evelyn shot back. "But let me be clear. Richard has been through enough. He doesn't need someone like you complicating things." The words stung, and Emily felt a lump forming in her throat. "Someone like me?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Evelyn folded her arms, her gaze unyielding. "Don't play coy. I've heard about your past. A waitress? A foster kid? You might have fooled Richard with your charm, but I see through it. You're out of your depth here, Miss Harper." This isn't your world. Emily's hands clenched at her sides. You're right, it's not my world. But I'm not here for wealth or status. I'm here because Sophie needs someone who cares about her. Evelyn scoffed. And what happens when Richard starts caring about you? Do you think you can just step into his life like it's some fairy tale? He'll come to his senses soon enough, and you'll be out of here. Emily didn't reply, her resolve crumbling under Evelyn's harsh words. After Evelyn left, Emily found herself retreating to the garden, needing space to clear her head. She sat on the bench where she and Sophie often worked on crafts, her mind racing. Evelyn's words had reopened old wounds, reminding her of the times she'd been told she wasn't enough, that she didn't belong. The thought of leaving crossed her mind. Maybe Evelyn was right. Maybe she was an outsider, intruding on a world she could never fully understand. But then she thought of Sophie, her tentative smiles, her whispered words, her growing confidence. Leaving would mean abandoning her, and Emily couldn't bear the thought. Later that evening, Richard noticed Emily's subdued demeanor during dinner. He frowned, setting down his fork. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Emily hesitated, forcing a small smile. "Just a long day." Richard didn't press further, but his gaze lingered on her. He could sense something was wrong, though he didn't yet know the storm Evelyn had unleashed. It was a quiet afternoon when Emily found herself tidying up the study. Richard had asked her to leave the room untouched, but Sophie had wandered in earlier and left her drawings scattered on the desk. Emily wanted to make sure everything was in its place before Richard returned home. As she moved a stack of papers aside, a small box caught her attention. It was tucked into the corner of the desk drawer, partially hidden beneath a ledger. Curious but hesitant, Emily carefully lifted it, its weight surprising her. The box was simple, lined with faded velvet, and bore initials engraved on the top, Edie. Emily hesitated, unsure if she should open it, but something about its presence felt significant. Slowly, she lifted the lid. Inside was a delicate gold locket, its surface etched with intricate floral designs. Emily's breath caught as she opened the locket to reveal two tiny photographs, one of Richard, looking younger and more carefree, and the other of a beautiful woman she immediately recognized from the family portraits. Eleanor Donovan, Richard's late wife. Beneath the locket was a folded piece of paper. She carefully unfolded it, revealing a handwritten note. The ink was smudged, but the words were clear. "For the life we built together, and the one we dreamed of. Forever yours, Eleanor." The words struck Emily, a poignant reminder of the life Richard had lost. She felt a pang of sadness, but also a deeper understanding of the man who had built walls so high around his heart. As she gently closed the locket and returned it to the box, the sound of footsteps startled her. She looked up to see Richard standing in the doorway, his expression dark and guarded. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low and sharp. Emily quickly set the box down, her cheeks flushing. I was cleaning. I didn't mean to intrude." Richard stepped forward, his jaw clenched. "That wasn't for you to find." "I'm sorry," Emily said softly, meeting his gaze. "I wasn't trying to invade your privacy. She hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's clear how much she meant to you." Richard's expression softened briefly, but then his walls went back up. "Leave it alone," he said, turning away abruptly. "There's nothing there for you to understand." Emily watched him retreat, the study door closing firmly behind him. She stood there for a moment, the weight of the locket's story lingering in the air. She didn't know what had driven her to open the box, but it was clear that whatever emotions it held for Richard were still raw and unresolved. Later that evening, as she sat with Sophie in the sunroom, Emily couldn't shake the image of Richard's face. How quickly his guard had gone up, how fiercely he still clung to his grief. It wasn't her place to push, but the keepsake had revealed a truth she couldn't ignore. Richard's pain wasn't just about loss. It was about love left unfinished, dreams that had been shattered, and a guilt that tethered him to the past. The rain poured heavily that evening, thunder rumbling in the distance. The mansion seemed even more isolated under the stormy skies, its vast halls filled with the muffled sound of raindrops against the windows. Emily sat in the kitchen, sipping tea and staring out at the tempest. She hadn't seen Richard since their tense exchange in the study, and the memory of his expression still lingered in her mind. She heard footsteps approaching. Richard appeared in the doorway, his silhouette outlined by the dim light from the hallway. His tie was loosened, his hair slightly disheveled, and his usual composure seemed cracked. "Emily," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "Do you have a moment?" She nodded, setting her mug down. "Of course." He motioned toward the sitting room, and they walked in silence. The fire crackling in the hearth provided a warm contrast to the storm outside. Richard sat down heavily in one of the armchairs, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. Emily took a seat across from him, sensing the weight of what he wanted to say. "I owe you an explanation," Richard began, his gaze fixed on the flames. "About Eleanor. About why I am the way I am." Emily didn't interrupt. She simply nodded, encouraging him to continue. Richard exhaled, the sound heavy with emotion. "The night she died, we had a fight. It was nothing extraordinary, just one of those arguments couples have. She wanted to slow down, to spend more time as a family. I was too focused on work, on the next big deal." His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed on. "She left to clear her head, to go for a drive. I thought it was nothing, just a cooling-off period. But she never came back." Emily's chest tightened as she watched him struggle to keep his composure. "The accident was sudden. They said she didn't suffer, but I can't help thinking." He paused, running a hand through his hair. "If I'd just listened, if I'd told her I'd change, she wouldn't have been on that road." Tears glistened in his eyes, though he blinked them away quickly. "Every day since, I've lived with that guilt. And now, every time I look at Sophie, I see Eleanor's pain, her disappointment in me." Emily leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "Richard, you can't carry all of that on your own. You didn't cause the accident. You couldn't have known." He shook his head. "I should have known. I should have been better." The room fell silent except for the steady crackle of the fire. After a moment, Emily spoke again, her own voice trembling. "I understand what it feels like to carry the weight of things you can't control," she said. "When my parents died, I was only 8. My brother was 5. I felt like it was my job to take care of him, to keep us both afloat, even when I was just a kid myself." She looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously. "We went into foster care, and it wasn't easy. I made mistakes, and I always felt like I was failing him. I thought if I could just be stronger, smarter, more responsible, everything would be okay. But life doesn't work like that." Richard met her eyes, his expression softening. "We both have ghosts, Richard," Emily continued. "But guilt doesn't help us move forward. It only keeps us trapped in the past." He leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words sinking in. "How do you let it go?" he asked quietly. Emily hesitated, her gaze flickering to the fire. "I don't know if you ever completely let it go, but you learn to live with it, to forgive yourself, and you lean on the people who care about you." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Richard felt a glimmer of hope. He wasn't sure he could forgive himself, but he realized he didn't have to face it alone. "I've been pushing you away," he admitted, "because letting someone in feels like a betrayal to Eleanor. But Sophie, she's happier with you here. And I don't know how to thank you for that." Emily's heart ached at his vulnerability. "You don't need to thank me, Richard. Sophie is an incredible little girl, and she's been through so much. I'm just glad I can be here for her. And for you." Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the storm outside seemed to fade into the background. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a fragile connection that neither of them dared to name. Richard stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "I don't say this enough, but thank you, Emily, for everything." She smiled softly. "You're welcome." As he left the room, Emily remained by the fire, the warmth of the flames mirroring the flicker of something new between them, a bond born of shared pain and perhaps the beginnings of healing. The air in the mansion grew heavier as Sophie lay curled up on her bed, her small frame buried under layers of blankets. The faint glow of her bedside lamp cast soft shadows on the walls, but the usual warmth of her room felt dimmed by the worry permeating the house. Emily sat beside her, gently brushing Sophie's damp curls from her forehead. The thermometer beeped, and Emily glanced at it with a concerned frown. Still high, she murmured to herself, placing a cool cloth on Sophie's brow. Sophie stirred but didn't open her eyes, her small hand clutching Mr. Floppy tightly. Richard appeared in the doorway, his tie removed and his sleeves rolled up, his usual stoic demeanor replaced with concern. "How is she?" he asked, stepping closer. "Her fever isn't breaking yet," Emily replied, her voice steady but laced with worry. "I've been giving her fluids and keeping her cool, but she needs rest." Richard nodded, his gaze fixed on Sophie's pale face. "If it gets worse, we'll call the doctor." Emily stood to adjust the humidifier by the bed, her movements deliberate and calm. She just needs time. Kids get through these things, but it's always hard to see them like this. As the hours passed, Emily stayed by Sophie's side, reading softly from a book whenever the little girl stirred. Richard joined her, sitting in the chair by the window, his presence quiet but steady. At one point, Sophie whimpered in her sleep, and Emily reached out instinctively, smoothing her hair. Richard watched her, struck by the tenderness in her every action. She had stepped into their lives so seamlessly, and in moments like these, he couldn't imagine facing this alone. The stillness was broken by Evelyn's sharp voice echoing from the hallway. "Richard." Evelyn's heels clicked against the floor as she appeared at the door. Her expression was one of feigned concern, but her tone was sharp. "I heard Sophie isn't well. And of course, Miss Harper is playing nursemaid." Richard's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Evelyn continued. "It's admirable, really, the way she inserts herself into every corner of your lives. But don't you think it's a bit calculated?" Emily's back stiffened, but she remained seated, her attention on Sophie. Richard stood, his posture tense. "Evelyn, this isn't the time." "Oh, I'm just trying to look out for you," Evelyn said, her smile brittle. "You've been through so much, and I'd hate to see you taken advantage of." "That's enough," Richard said firmly, his voice low but commanding. "Emily has done nothing but care for Sophie, and for that, I'm grateful. If you can't see that, perhaps you should leave." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, but she relented, her tone icy. "Very well. But don't say I didn't warn you." She turned and left, her heels echoing down the hallway. Richard exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. He glanced at Emily, who hadn't moved from Sophie's side. "I'm sorry about her," he said quietly. "You don't have to apologize," Emily replied, her voice steady but soft. "I'm here for Sophie, not anyone else's approval." Richard sat back down in the chair, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I don't know how you do it. Stay calm through all this." Emily finally turned to look at him, her eyes meeting his. "When you care about someone, you just do what needs to be done." Her words hung in the air, carrying a meaning neither of them spoke aloud. As the night deepened, Sophie stirred again, her fever finally beginning to subside. Emily let out a breath of relief, slumping slightly in her chair. Richard noticed and stood, stepping closer to her. "You've been up all night," he said gently. "You should rest." "I'll be fine," Emily insisted, though her exhaustion was evident. Richard hesitated before reaching out, his hand lightly brushing her shoulder. The touch was brief, but it was enough to make Emily look up at him, her guard slipping for just a moment. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and sincere. "For everything." Emily smiled faintly, the warmth in his eyes making her chest tighten. "She's a wonderful little girl, Richard. She deserves all the care in the world." "And so do you," he replied before he could stop himself. The words hung between them, charged with a quiet intensity. Emily felt her breath hitch, but she quickly looked away, focusing back on Sophie. "I should stay with her," she said softly. Richard nodded, retreating slightly but not leaving the room. He stayed by the window, his presence a silent reassurance. For the first time, the distance between them felt less like a barrier and more like a bridge, one they were both hesitant to cross but couldn't ignore. The tension in the Donovan household was palpable the next morning. Sophie's fever had subsided, but the storm Evelyn had stirred showed no signs of clearing. Emily stood in the kitchen, staring blankly at the steaming cup of tea in her hands. She replayed Evelyn's sharp words from the night before, each one cutting deeper than she cared to admit. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of heels clicking sharply against the floor. Emily turned to see Evelyn, her expression as cold as ever, entering the room. "We need to talk," Evelyn said curtly, her voice leaving no room for argument. Emily straightened her posture, bracing herself. "What is it, Mrs. Cooper?" Evelyn's lips curled into a mocking smile. "I've done a bit of digging, Miss Harper. It wasn't difficult, really. A few calls, a few questions, and your story unraveled quite neatly." Emily's stomach churned, but she kept her face neutral. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, don't play coy," Evelyn said, stepping closer. "A foster kid who worked her way through menial jobs, barely scraping by? And now you've landed here, in this mansion, taking care of my niece. Quite the leap, isn't it?" Emily's hands tightened around her cup, but she refused to let Evelyn see her falter. Evelyn's smile turned razor-sharp. "What do you think people will say when they hear about your past? About your less-than-savory beginnings? Do you really think someone like you belongs in this world?" Emily's voice was steady, though her heart was racing. "My past doesn't define my present, and I've done nothing but care for Sophie with everything I have." Evelyn tilted her head, feigning sympathy. "Oh, I'm sure you've been very dedicated. But people will talk, Emily, and they'll question Richard's judgment as they should." Before Emily could respond, Richard's voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Evelyn." Both women turned to see Richard standing in the doorway, his expression thunderous. Evelyn folded her arms, unfazed. "Richard, I'm only trying to protect you. You can't let someone like her." "I said enough," he repeated, stepping forward. His gaze was firm, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Emily's past is none of your business. What matters is what she's done for Sophie, for this family." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Family? Richard, don't tell me you're letting your emotions cloud your judgment." Again. Richard's jaw tightened. "You don't get to question my decisions or her integrity. Emily has been a blessing in Sophie's life and in mine." Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. "You'll regret this," she said coldly before sweeping out of the room. The silence that followed was heavy. Emily set her cup down, her hands trembling slightly. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," Richard replied firmly, turning to her. "She had no right to speak to you that way." Emily hesitated, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "Richard, I appreciate what you said, but she's not wrong." Richard frowned. "What are you talking about?" "I don't belong here," Emily said, her voice cracking. "I've tried so hard, but every time someone like Evelyn reminds me of where I came from, I can't help but feel like they're right." Richard stepped closer, his expression softening. "Emily, you've done more for Sophie than anyone ever could. And for me, you've shown me there's more to life than guilt and isolation." Emily shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "You and Sophie deserve stability, not someone who's constantly being questioned. Maybe it's better if I leave." The words hung in the air like a hammer blow. Richard's face darkened, a flicker of panic in his eyes. "You can't mean that." "I don't want to cause more trouble," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Richard reached out, his hand brushing her arm. "You're not causing trouble. You've been the one holding us together." Emily stepped back, her resolve firm despite the ache in her chest. "Sophie is stronger now. She'll be okay. And so will you." She turned and walked away, leaving Richard standing in the kitchen, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Later that evening, Emily packed her things in her room, tears streaming silently down her face. She didn't want to leave, but she couldn't ignore the growing weight of Evelyn's words and the doubt they planted in her heart. As she zipped her suitcase shut, Sophie appeared in the doorway, clutching her drawing of the three of them holding hands. Her small voice trembled. "Are you leaving?" Emily knelt, pulling Sophie into a hug. "I'll always care about you, Sophie. Don't ever forget that." Richard watched from the hallway, his heart breaking at the sight. As Emily pulled away from Sophie, he knew he couldn't let her leave, not like this. The storm that had been brewing all afternoon finally broke, sending sheets of rain cascading down the windows of the Donovan mansion. The air inside was just as charged, thick with tension from the argument that had erupted between Richard and Emily in the living room. "You're running away," Richard said, his voice rising with uncharacteristic frustration. "You think leaving solves anything? It only hurts Sophie more." Emily's voice trembled, though she held her ground. "I'm not running, Richard. I'm doing what's best for her. And for you." "What's best for us?" he scoffed, running a hand through his damp hair. "You think uprooting the one person Sophie trusts is what's best?" "She'll be fine," Emily insisted, though her voice cracked under the weight of her own doubt. "She has you." The sound of a door slamming upstairs made them both pause. Emily's heart sank as the realization hit her. "Sophie," she whispered, turning toward the stairs. They raced up to her room, finding it empty. The window was slightly ajar, rain dripping onto the sill. "She's gone," Emily breathed, panic rising in her chest. Richard grabbed his coat. "We have to find her. Now." The storm raged as they searched the sprawling property, calling Sophie's name into the wind. Emily's heart pounded, fear clawing at her with every second Sophie was missing. She couldn't have gone far, Richard shouted over the rain, his eyes scanning the dark woods that bordered the estate. Emily wiped the rain from her face, her voice shaking. "She's scared. She probably thinks it's her fault we were arguing. That's not her burden to carry," Richard muttered, his guilt deepening. They split up to cover more ground, the storm soaking them to the bone. Emily searched near the garden, her voice raw from shouting Sophie's name. Her mind raced with worst-case scenarios, but she pushed them aside, focusing on finding the little girl. Richard stumbled through the muddy forest trails, his flashlight cutting through the downpour. The guilt he'd been carrying for years now felt unbearable. His failures as a husband, as a father, they all seemed to culminate in this moment. "Sophie," he shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. "Please come back." A faint sound reached his ears, sobbing. He turned toward it, his heart leaping. "Emily," he called over his shoulder. "I think I've found her." Emily appeared moments later, breathless and drenched, just as Richard reached a small clearing. There, huddled beneath a large oak tree, was Sophie, clutching something tightly against her chest. "Sophie!" Emily cried, rushing forward. The little girl looked up, her face streaked with tears. She held her drawing, the one of herself, Emily, and Richard holding hands, close to her heart. "Don't fight," she whimpered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I don't want you to go." Emily dropped to her knees, pulling Sophie into a tight embrace. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. We weren't fighting because of you. None of this is your fault." Richard knelt beside them, his own voice breaking. "I'm sorry too, Sophie. We love you, and we're going to fix this. I promise." Sophie clung to them both, her small frame shaking with sobs. The three of them stayed huddled under the tree, the storm raging around them, but the warmth of their connection offering a sense of safety. Back at the mansion, after Sophie was dried and tucked into bed, Richard and Emily sat in the living room, both exhausted but unable to sleep. "She shouldn't have to feel like that," Richard said quietly, his gaze fixed on the fire, "like she's going to lose everything all over again." Emily nodded, her voice soft. "She's been through so much. And She hesitated, then continued. "I never wanted to be the reason she felt more pain." Richard turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "You're not. If anything, you've brought more love and healing into this house than I thought was possible." Emily looked away, her fingers twisting nervously. "But I'm still leaving, Richard. I've made up my mind." He reached out, his hand covering hers. "Emily, don't. Tonight proved something to me, that Sophie needs you. And so do I." Her breath hitched, but she didn't pull away. The vulnerability in his voice, the sincerity in his eyes. It was almost too much to bear. "I'm scared," Emily admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "So am I," Richard replied, his grip tightening on her hand. "But maybe we can face that fear together." Emily didn't answer right away, her mind racing. She thought of Sophie's tearful plea, of the bond they'd built, and of the man sitting beside her, flawed but trying, guarded yet open in ways she hadn't expected. "I need time," she said finally, her voice trembling. Richard nodded, a flicker of hope lighting his features. "Take all the time you need. Just don't leave yet." For Sophie, Emily met his gaze, and for the first time, she allowed herself to hope too. The morning after the storm dawned calm and bright, the air fresh and cool as sunlight spilled into the Donovan mansion. Despite the serene weather outside, the atmosphere within the house was heavy with unresolved emotions. Emily stood in the sunroom, absently tidying Sophie's scattered crayons and drawings. Her mind was a swirl of thoughts: Sophie's tearful plea, Richard's words, and her own inner conflict. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Richard approach. "Emily." His voice broke through her reverie, startling her. She turned, her heart skipping a beat at the sight of him. He looked different this morning, less guarded, though his expression was serious. "We need to talk," he said, stepping closer. Emily nodded, her throat tightening. "All right." He gestured toward the garden, and they walked in silence until they reached the bench beneath the large oak tree where Sophie had been found the night before. Richard stopped and turned to face her, his hands shoved deep into his pockets as though he needed to anchor himself. "I've been thinking about what happened last night," he began, his voice steady but low. "About Sophie, about us, and about everything I've been holding on to for too long." Emily's heart raced, but she stayed quiet, letting him speak. "For years, I've carried this guilt," Richard continued, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I thought if I stayed distant, if I focused on work and kept my emotions locked away, I could somehow protect Sophie, protect myself. But all I've done is hurt the people I care about the most." He looked up then, his eyes meeting hers, raw and unguarded. "You've shown me what it means to care, Emily, what it means to really see someone, to let them in. And I've been so afraid of losing that again that I almost pushed you away." Emily felt her breath catch, tears threatening to well in her eyes. "I can't keep running from the past," Richard said, his voice breaking slightly. "And I can't keep pretending that I don't feel something for you. Because I do. I care about you, Emily, more than I've let myself admit." Her lips parted in surprise, and the tears she'd been holding back spilled over. "Richard," she whispered, shaking her head slightly, "I don't know what to say." He stepped closer, his voice softening. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. You've brought light back into this house, into Sophie's life, and into mine. And I don't want to lose you." Emily's emotions swirled: gratitude, fear, and an overwhelming sense of relief. She took a shaky breath, her hands trembling at her sides. "I've been so afraid," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid of not belonging here, of being a burden, of failing Sophie, of failing you. But you've given me more than I ever expected: kindness, trust, and a chance to be part of something meaningful." She stepped closer, her voice steadying. "And the truth is, I care about you too, Richard. I've tried to push it down, to tell myself it's not right, but I can't ignore it anymore." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Then, as if drawn together by an invisible force, Richard reached for her hand. His touch was gentle but firm, grounding her in the moment. "You belong here, Emily," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "With Sophie, with me." Emily's heart swelled, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. She squeezed his hand, a small smile breaking through her tears. "I want to stay," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I want to be here, for Sophie and for you." Richard's lips curved into a rare, genuine smile, and in that moment, the weight of their fears and uncertainties seemed to lift. The world outside the garden faded away, leaving only the two of them and the promise of a new beginning. As they stood beneath the oak tree, the sunlight filtering through its branches, the connection between them felt undeniable, fragile yet strong, like the first breath of spring after a long winter. The Donovan mansion basked in the warmth of spring sunlight, a reflection of the changes that had swept through its walls. Laughter and lightness replaced the echoes of loneliness that had once defined the house. Emily stood in the kitchen, her hands busy kneading dough for Sophie's favorite bread. The sound of Sophie's cheerful humming at the dining table reached her ears, drawing a smile to her face. Sophie was arranging a bouquet of wildflowers, carefully placing each stem in a glass jar. "Do you think Daddy will like it?" she asked, glancing at Emily. "He'll love it," Emily replied, her voice soft with affection. The little girl beamed. "I picked them so he'd have something happy to look at when he works." Before Emily could respond, Richard entered the room, his casual attire and relaxed expression a stark contrast to the man he had been months ago. He paused, taking in the scene before him. A happy daughter and a woman who had brought light back into their lives. "What's all this?" he asked, his voice laced with curiosity. "Flowers for your desk," Sophie declared, holding up the jar proudly. Richard knelt beside her, his eyes shining. "They're perfect. Thank you, sweetheart." Emily watched the exchange, her heart swelling. She was no longer an outsider. She was part of their world, woven into the fabric of their lives in a way that felt unshakable. Later that morning, Richard retreated to his study. There was a phone call he had been avoiding but could no longer delay. Evelyn's interference had cast a shadow over their progress for too long. He dialed her number, and when she answered, her voice was sharp and expectant. "Richard, finally. I've been meaning to discuss." "I'm calling to tell you that this stops now," he interrupted, his tone firm and resolute. A pause, then a faint scoff. "What are you talking about?" "Evelyn, your judgment and interference have done more harm than good. Emily is staying, and your opinions about her are not welcome in my life, or Sophie's." Her voice sharpened. "You're making a mistake, Richard. That woman, she's a part of our family," he said, his voice steady. "She's given Sophie the care and love she deserves, and she's brought healing to this house. If you can't respect that, then I'm afraid this is goodbye." Evelyn's protests fell on deaf ears as Richard ended the call. For the first time in years, he felt free to prioritize the family he was rebuilding without the weight of Evelyn's disapproval. That afternoon, the three of them worked together in the garden, planting flowers along the edges of the stone pathway. Sophie knelt with a small trowel, her laughter ringing out as Mr. Floppy hopped through the grass. "Are we planting these here every year?" Sophie asked, glancing between Emily and Richard. Emily smiled. "We can if you'd like." "I'd love that," Sophie said. "It can be our tradition," Richard added, his voice warm. As they dug and planted, Emily felt a deep sense of belonging. She looked at Sophie, her hands muddy but her smile radiant, and at Richard, whose quiet confidence now held a tenderness she had grown to cherish. "Don't forget the marigolds," Sophie exclaimed, holding up a small plant. Emily laughed. "How could I forget? They're your favorite." Richard chuckled, leaning closer to Emily as Sophie focused on her planting. "I think we're in for a very colorful garden," he said softly. Emily turned to him, their eyes meeting. "Colorful is good." For a moment, everything seemed to slow. The warmth of the sun, the scent of the freshly turned soil, the laughter of a child. It was the kind of peace that Emily had always dreamed of but never thought she'd find. As the day turned to evening, they stood together in the living room, gazing at a new addition above the mantel. The family portrait was simple yet full of meaning. Sophie stood between Emily and Richard, her grin as bright as the sunlight in the garden. "It's perfect," Sophie said, holding Emily's hand tightly. "It really is," Emily replied, her voice thick with emotion. Richard draped an arm around both of them, his voice filled with conviction. "This is where we're meant to be. Together." Emily looked at the man who had once seemed so distant, now standing before her with an open heart. The fear and uncertainty that had plagued her melted away, replaced by a quiet confidence that this was her home too. As they sat together by the fire that evening, Sophie nestled between them. Emily knew their journey was only just beginning. They had found not just a home but a life filled with hope, love, and the promise of new beginnings.